I am Gerard, 72 years old, and still trying to make sense of the night my own son moved to cut me out of his life entirely. As a retired logistics founder, I spent decades building an empire, all while keeping my true wealth hidden, hoping to instill in my son a genuine respect for hard work. That lesson failed miserably. Last night at exactly 1:00 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text from my son, Colin. It read, "We need distance from you. Please stop contacting us." When I stepped into the hallway, my daughter-in-law Simone was already standing over my packed bag, smirking. "Colin does not want an argument," she said. "Call an Uber." I simply nodded, left my keys on the walnut entryway console, and walked out into the freezing rain. But from the back of my taxi, I sent a single reply. "Of course, I will cancel my direct deposits first. One more thing, do you know who really owns the mansion? Gerstamt, woonste Starpevik." The silence of the house at 1:00 in the morning used to be my favorite hour. It was the only time the sprawling suburban mansion felt something close to a real home rather than an elaborately dressed stage. I had been lying awake in the small East Wing bedroom, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the soft tick of freezing rain against the window pane. My joints ached with their familiar stiffness, a steady reminder of the 72 years behind me, a good many of them spent hauling heavy crates long before I ever sat behind a desk. Then the harsh white light of my phone flared up from the nightstand, slicing through the dark. I reached over and grabbed it, squinting against the glare. The message was from Colin. I held the screen and let the words settle. "We need distance from you. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where real family pain meets real consequences. If this is your first time here, tap subscribe so the next story finds its way to you. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments who are you already rooting for in this one, and why. I genuinely love to know. A quick note, some details in this story have been shaped for dramatic storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is purely coincidental. What matters most here is the truth underneath the telling. Your presence is disrupting our lifestyle. Please stop contacting us. I read the text 3 times. There had been no preceding argument, no explosive dinner conversation, only this cold clinical dismissal delivered through a screen from a man sleeping just down the hall. I pushed the heavy duvet aside and swung my legs over the edge of the bed. My bare feet found the hardwood floor. I did not feel anger in that moment. What settled into my chest was a profound, hollow weight. I pulled on my robe, my mind demanding a face-to-face accounting. "You do not remove your father from his home," with a text message. I stepped into the long, dimly lit corridor. The only sound was the steady, measured ticking of the antique long case clock standing at the end of the hall, a beautiful, ornate piece. It had been Dorothea's favorite. That sound sent a sharp ache rising to my throat. When my wife died 10 years ago, a massive void tore open in my life, and I made the catastrophic mistake of trying to fill it by handing Colin everything he ever wanted. I believed I was comforting a grieving son. I understood now I was only watering the roots of his entitlement. The clock's ticking seemed to mark my foolishness with each step as I moved toward the main foyer. I came around the corner, fully expecting to go straight up to Colin's master suite. Instead, my path was stopped cold. Standing beneath the glow of the crystal chandelier was my daughter-in-law Simone, fully dressed in her cashmere loungewear, arms folded across her chest. At her feet sat my 3 battered canvas duffel bags, already zipped, already packed, already dumped carelessly onto the floor. Simone did not look surprised to see me standing there. If anything, the corners of her mouth curved upward into a thin, self-satisfied smirk. Before I could form a single question, she lifted her foot and nudged one of the heavy bags in my direction. "Colin does not want an argument," she said, her voice soaked in absolute indifference. "Leave the keys on the console. Call an Uber." I stood there and looked at the woman my son had chosen to marry. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I did not ask where exactly I was meant to go in the middle of a winter night. I simply looked down at the cold, imported marble beneath my feet. I had paid for that marble. Every vein running through that stone was purchased with decades of sweat, years I spent building my company from a single delivery truck. But looking at Simone's sneer, a very specific memory washed over me. The day she married Colin, she had thrown an absolute tantrum over the wedding budget, insisting on a $60,000 ceremony to impress her circle of high society friends. I had written the check without a word, handing it over, quietly, foolishly, convinced it was a one-time gesture to secure their happiness. I could see now that my generosity was never received as a gift. It had been read as submission. I reached into the pocket of my robe and drew out the heavy brass keys to the house. I crossed to the walnut entryway console and set them down. The metallic click rang out sharply in the hollow quiet of the foyer. I did not look at Simone again. I gathered the handles of my bags, pushed open the heavy front door, and walked into the biting cold. The freezing rain hit my face at once, soaking through my robe and cutting straight to the bone. I did not look back. 10 minutes later, I was in the back of a damp, poorly heated taxi, giving the driver the address of a cheap highway motel on the edge of town. The cab smelled of stale air freshener. I took out my phone. The screen lit up my wet, lined face. I opened the messaging app, pulled up Colin's text, the one ordering me to stop making contact, and let my thumbs rest above the keyboard. I did not write a paragraph of sorrow. I did not demand answers. I typed a handful of short, deliberate sentences. Of course, I will cancel my direct deposits first. One more thing. Do you know who really owns the mansion? I pressed send. I watched the small status icon beneath the message. Within seconds, the word red appeared. The taxi tires hissed over wet asphalt as we cut through the dark city. I gazed out through the rain-streaked glass. We rolled past the sprawling industrial park on the west side of town, the very same grounds where I had built my logistics empire. 40 years of work turning one rusted delivery van into a regional powerhouse. When I finally sold it, I walked away with $15 million. But I never gave Colin the real number. I had buried the wealth inside a blind trust, convinced that keeping him in the dark would push him to build something of his own. It was an old man's wishful thinking. The reality was that concealing my success had only made him feel entitled to whatever scraps he imagined I possessed. I glanced down at my phone again. The screen was alive. 3 small gray dots bounced at the bottom of the chat window. Colin was typing. Then the dots vanished. Then they came back faster than before. I could picture him upright in his expensive bed, the color draining from his face, as the meaning of my message broke through the walls of his manufactured world. He was panicking. I did not wait for his excuses. I did not wait for the backpedaling or the frantic demands for an explanation. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it until the screen went black, dropping the back of the cab into total darkness. The rain hammered the roof as I pressed my head against the cold window. The silent adjustment had officially begun. Dawn pushed through the cheap plastic blinds of the highway motel, laying pale fractured strips of light across the stained carpet. The neon sign outside buzzed with a low mechanical hum, blinking its faded red vacancy notice into the frozen morning air. I sat on the edge of a mattress that gave no support, breathing in stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial cleaner. I am 72 years old, a man who built a regional logistics empire from nothing. A man whose net worth sits comfortably in the 8 figures. And yet, there I was, shivering in a $40 roadside room on the city's outskirts, cast out into the winter rain by my own blood. I had not slept a single minute. My mind was too sharp, too locked onto the cold, hard shape of what had happened only hours before. The initial shock of standing in that marble foyer, staring at my packed bags and my daughter-in-law's smug expression had fully dissolved. What replaced it was a chilling, absolute clarity. For years, grief had made me blind. When Dorothea died, I lost my anchor. I tried to fill the crushing silence of that enormous house by giving Colin whatever he asked, hoping his contentment would somehow become my peace. I told myself I was being a devoted father. Sitting in that dim motel room, I finally admitted the truth. I had not been a father to Colin in a very long time. I had been an ATM. I got to my feet joints cracking in the cold air and crossed to the small scratched laminate desk wedged into the corner of the room. I unzipped my briefcase, pulled out my laptop, and lifted the lid, the hinge creaking the screen, casting pale light across my tired face. I connected to the motel's unsecured internet and opened my secure browser. My fingers settled above the keyboard for one brief moment before I typed in the address for my primary wealth management portal. The login demanded multiple authentications. I entered each password with a steady, deliberate hand. The dashboard loaded liquid assets, checking accounts, credit lines, all of it spread across the screen. I bypassed the investment portfolios entirely and clicked straight into the joint operational account, the one I had foolishly attached to Colin's life. The transaction history filled the screen, a descending column of numbers that told the complete pathetic story of my son's existence. I let the data settle over me. Thousands of dollars at high-end steakhouses, charges for imported wine luxury car lease payments, and steep monthly dues for a country club Colin barely set foot in. Every line item was a monument to a fraudulent lifestyle, a man performing the role of a self-made titan entirely on my dime. I scrolled down to the recurring transfers section. There it was. An automated outbound transfer scheduled for the first of every month. $12,000. The memo line beside it read, Project Support. I stared at those two words, Project Support. 5 years ago, Colin had walked into my study carrying a glossy, poorly researched business plan. He told me he was launching a revolutionary tech startup and app that would upend the delivery industry. He spoke with real passion, with a kind of desperate energy, swearing this was his moment to step out of my shadow and carve out his own legacy. He needed seed money, he said, a monthly operational budget to pay developers and lock down server space. I knew the plan was flawed. Any seasoned investor would have tossed it without a second glance. But I looked at my son's eager face, and I remembered Dorothea's dying wish that I be patient with him. And I agreed to fund it. There was no tech startup. There were no developers. The project never got off the ground. The $12,000 a month quietly drifted from business funding into a slush fund for Simone's designer wardrobe and Colin's image upkeep. Month after month, year after year, the money disappeared into the black hole of their vanity. I had known it deep down. I had simply chosen to look away, terrified that cutting the money off would mean cutting my last remaining thread to my family. But last night they cut that thread themselves. They tossed me out like discarded rubbish, convinced that because they lived under my roof and spent my money, the power somehow belonged to them. They had completely forgotten whose name sat on the trust. I moved the cursor to the recurring transfer. The arrow hovered over the button marked Cancel. My hand did not shake. My breathing was slow and level. I could feel the accumulated weight of the past decade beginning to lift from my shoulders. This was not merely a financial transaction. This was an execution. I was dropping the guillotine on the illusion I had spent years maintaining. By pressing this button, I was dismantling the foundation that Colin's entire world rested on. I pressed down on the trackpad. A small confirmation window appeared, asking whether I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently delete this recurring payment. I clicked Confirm. The screen refreshed. The $12,000 transfer disappeared from the dashboard. Gone. The safety net was officially down. I settled back in the cheap plastic chair, listening to rain tap against the motel window, and felt a profound, icy liberation move through me. The bleeding had stopped. The parasite had been detached. I drew a slow breath of the stale air and prepared to work through the insurance policies and auto loans, ready to burn their financial world to the ground account by account, when a sharp, piercing chime rang out from the laptop speakers. A red alert banner slid down from the top corner of the banking portal. An emergency fraud notification from my secondary platinum card, the card I had handed Colin 5 years ago strictly for medical emergencies. I clicked the alert, eyes narrowing as the details loaded. 2 separate charges had just been attempted, $4,000 each, $8,000 total at a high-end downtown luxury designer boutique. The timestamp showed the transaction was happening at that very moment. I stared at the screen. A cold, dark fury settled around my heart. It was 7 in the morning. Simone had put a 72-year-old man out into the freezing rain at 1 in the morning, and the first thing she did when the sun came up was go online to run $8,000 worth of designer purchases on his card. They did not simply want distance from me. They intended to bleed my corpse dry while I was still breathing. I leaned toward the screen, its glow reflected in my eyes, and clicked into the security controls for the platinum card. The game had just changed. I watched the pending transactions pulse on the screen like a neon warning. $8,000 at a downtown luxury designer boutique charged moments after my son and his wife had thrown me into the freezing rain. My hand hovered above the trackpad, trembling slightly, not from the chill of that damp motel room, but from a deep and sickening realization. I remembered the exact afternoon I had placed that heavy metal card into Colin's hand. 5 years ago, shortly after he had complained of a sudden health scare and the steep out-of-pocket costs his inadequate insurance refused to cover. I had sat him down in my study, the leather chair creaking as I leaned forward. I looked him directly in the eye and told him plainly this card was for medical crises or genuine emergencies only. I wanted him to have a safety net, something that meant he would never face a true catastrophe alone. Now staring at that bright screen in this bleak room, I understood that the only crisis my son and his wife were facing was a shortage in their luxury wardrobes. They were celebrating my eviction with a morning shopping trip. I navigated to the card controls. With a single click, I selected the option to report unauthorized use and permanently freeze the account. A prompt asked me to confirm. I clicked yes. The system updated at once, throwing a bright red banner across the account. The card was now locked. Somewhere downtown, standing at a gleaming glass counter, Simone was about to hand that platinum card to a cashier. In a matter of seconds, she would feel the very first consequence of her arrogance. The thought brought me no satisfaction, only a heavy necessary resolve. The bleeding had to stop, and I was the only one who could close the wound. But the credit card was only the beginning. If I was going to sever these cords, I had to cut them completely, no loose threads left for them to grab hold of. I picked up my cell phone, unlocked the screen, and dialed the 24-hour customer service line for my premium auto insurance provider. The automated system walked me through the prompts until a live representative came on the line. A polite young man named Arnie asked how he could help me that morning. I cleared my throat, keeping my voice steady and even. I need to remove 2 vehicles from my master policy, I told him, immediately. I recited the license plate numbers from memory, the sleek imported luxury SUVs that Colin and Simone drove around town. Vehicles I had co-signed and insured under my corporate umbrella policy, foolishly absorbing their financial liability and keeping their monthly premiums almost nothing. Arnie paused his keyboard, going quiet for a moment. Sir, if I remove these vehicles, they will be completely uninsured from this moment forward. It is illegal to operate them on public roads without proper coverage. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I am completely certain, I replied. Those vehicles are no longer my responsibility. I listened as he worked through the request, the finality of it settling over me like a weighted blanket. Those cars were Colin's ultimate status symbols, the gleaming armor he wore to project the image of a self-made man in front of his country club crowd. By midday, driving either one of them out of the driveway would carry serious financial and legal risk. A routine traffic stop or a minor fender bender would shatter that illusion on the spot. I thanked Arnie and ended the call. I turned back to the laptop. The motel room was still cold, the inadequate wall heater rattling weakly in the corner, but I barely registered the chill. I was working with a clinical detached precision I had not called upon since my days negotiating hard-edge freight contracts. I logged into the cellular provider portal and suspended the unlimited data lines on their mobile phones, setting the termination to take effect at the end of the billing cycle 3 short days away. I pulled up the country club management website and submitted a formal withdrawal of Colin's sponsored family membership. Every luxury they enjoyed, every convenience they took for granted, was tied directly to my name, my unblemished credit history, and my life's labor. I cut them away one by one, click by click, account by account. For decades, I had carried the crushing weight of their lives on my back, convinced that if I let go, Colin would fall and never find his footing again. I had told myself that my endless financial support was a substitute for the mother he had lost too soon away to hold our fractured family together. But looking at the row of canceled accounts and frozen assets on that screen, I could no longer deny what was plainly in front of me. My support had not saved my son. It had ruined him completely. It had hollowed him out until he was the kind of man who could look his 72-year-old father in the eye and put him out into the winter night without a moment's hesitation. I was not destroying his life this morning. I was simply compelling him to live the life he had actually earned. I leaned back in the cheap plastic chair and pressed my palms against my tired, burning eyes. The process was nearly complete. The financial fortress they had lived inside so comfortably was now effectively a heap of rubble. They just did not know it yet. I reached for the lukewarm cup of terrible motel coffee I had drawn from the lobby machine an hour earlier. Just as I brought it to my lips, a sharp, distinct chime cut through the silence of the room. Not a standard text alert, a high-priority email notification. I set the foam cup on the scratched laminate desk and leaned toward the screen. The sender was the private security firm contracted to monitor the sprawling estate I had just been expelled from. I clicked the subject line, my pulse picking up. The message was an automated alert. Someone was actively attempting to override the master alarm codes from the main control panel inside the mansion foyer. I shut the laptop, that chime still sounding in my head. Colin was not content with putting me out into the winter rain. He was now trying to lock me out of my own property by changing the master alarm codes at the mansion. I did not panic. I packed my computer into my worn leather briefcase, pulled on my damp overcoat, and walked out of the freezing motel room. I drove my rental car through the unrelenting morning downpour toward a small Greasy Spoon diner on the industrial edge of the commercial district. It was the kind of place defined by cracked vinyl booths, the thick smell of burnt coffee, and absolutely no risk of crossing paths with anyone from my son's manufactured high society circle. I took a quiet corner booth, ordered a plain black coffee, and waited for my reinforcements. 20 minutes later, Alton Beckett came through the fogged glass doors. He was a sharp 52-year-old attorney who always looked as though he had just stepped out of a high-stakes courtroom. He shook the rain from his charcoal overcoat umbrella, spotted me in the corner, and slid into the booth across from me. I offered no warm greeting and no small talk. I unzipped my briefcase, pulled out the laptop, turned the screen to face him, and pushed it across the sticky laminate table. Alton adjusted his glasses and studied the glowing display. I had left the evidence open for his review. First, he read the text from Colin, the one demanding distance, and ordering my removal at 1:00 in the morning. Next, he examined the banking portal, showing the canceled $12,000 monthly transfer. Then his eyes moved to the security alert for the $8,000 in attempted purchases on the frozen platinum card. Finally, he read the notification from the estate security firm, showing someone aggressively trying to tamper with the alarm panel in the main foyer. Alton worked through the digital wreckage in complete silence. He did not gasp. He offered no hollow sympathy or theatrical shock. He is a man built for legal warfare, and he simply assessed the battlefield laid out before him. He pushed the laptop back across the table and folded his hands with quiet precision. "They think you are a helpless old man staying in their house." Alton said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the diner noise. "They forgot whose name is actually on the trust." I looked down at my black coffee and felt the full weight of that observation. Alton had managed my financial trust for 15 years. He knew every concealed asset, every property boundary, and every offshore account I held. More than that, he was the only person who had ever had the nerve to look me square in the eye and tell me an uncomfortable truth about my own son. Years ago, shortly after my wife Dorothea passed away, I had sat in Alton's office to establish the blind trust. My intention was to shield the bulk of my $15 million logistics fortune from Colin to give him a modest safety net while keeping enough pressure on him to build a real work ethic. Alton had warned me even then. He told me that subsidizing Colin's lifestyle, even in part, would prevent him from developing any real character. He cautioned that placing unearned luxury within a young man's reach would cause his sense of entitlement to eventually turn malignant. I had argued fiercely with him that day. I told him I was simply looking after my grieving son. I looked up at Alton now, in that dim diner, the full bitterness of my own foolishness pressing down on my chest. "You were right," I said quietly, the exhaustion of the past decade in every syllable. "You were right about him all along." I watered a weed, fully expecting it to grow into an oak tree. Alton did not gloat. He simply nodded and took a sip of the terrible diner coffee the waitress had just poured. "You gave him everything, Gerard," he said, his voice firm and level. "You gave him a mansion he did not buy, cars he did not earn, and a social standing he could never have supported on his own. It is not surprising he eventually convinced himself he was master of the estate. But delusions do not hold up in a court of law. The mansion belongs entirely to the Dorothea Whitlow Trust. You are the sole trustee. Colin is nothing more than a non-paying guest who has drastically overstayed his welcome." I asked Alton what our immediate legal standing was regarding the house and the remaining assets. He explained that since there was no formal lease agreement in place, Colin and Simone were legally considered tenants at will. We could initiate formal eviction proceedings the very next morning and lock down every remaining peripheral asset tied to my name. I leaned across the table and told him I wanted it done immediately. I wanted the trust tightened to the point of absolute suffocation. I wanted every financial bridge burned so completely that they would not be able to find the ashes. I wanted them to feel the same biting cold of the reality they had imposed on me. As Alton began listing the specific legal documents we would need to file before the close of business, his cell phone vibrated against the laminate tabletop. He glanced at the screen. A faint frown crossed his otherwise composed face. He picked up the phone and raised a single finger, asking for silence. I watched his expression move from professional curiosity to a hard, calculating stare as he absorbed what was being said on the other end. He ended the call and set the phone down slowly. The air in our corner booth suddenly felt very dense. My firm automatically monitors any legal inquiries involving the name of your estate, he said, his voice dropping a full register. We put those alerts in place years ago as a basic security measure. I nodded, pulse climbing, waiting for him to go on. Alton leaned in, his eyes holding mine with a sharp and direct urgency. That was my senior paralegal. Your son just contacted the office of a notorious family law attorney downtown, a man who specializes in aggressive hostile conservatorships. A chill moved down my spine that had nothing to do with the rain outside. I asked Alton exactly what Colin was inquiring about. Colin is asking about the expedited legal process for having a senior citizen declared mentally incompetent. Alton replied, and the words landed like a physical strike. He is actively pursuing emergency power of attorney over all your assets on the grounds that you are suffering from severe dementia. The air in the diner felt remarkably heavy after that. The waitress came and refilled our cups, but I let mine sit untouched until it went cold. I looked out through the rain-streaked window at the flat gray morning, turning over the sheer clinical cruelty of what Colin was attempting. He did not simply want my money. He wanted to erase my autonomy entirely, to have me locked away in a facility and stripped of my basic rights, all so he could go on performing the role of a wealthy socialite without interruption. I brought my attention back to Alton. He had already opened his briefcase and drawn out a sleek silver tablet, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. He did not wait for my instruction. We had known each other far too long for that. He was already drafting the countermeasures. I am filing an immediate irrevocable amendment to the trust, Alton said, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur so the surrounding tables could not follow. We are stripping his name from every single clause. Gerard, Alton said, he will no longer be the automatic successor trustee, nor will he hold any standing as a beneficiary of the estate in any capacity. I need you to tell me exactly where you want the assets directed upon your passing. I did not need a moment to think. I already knew the answer. Direct the entirety of the estate and all liquid assets to the Regional Veterans Housing Charity. I told him, keeping my voice steady. Set up an endowment. Make sure the board of directors is fully insulated from any legal challenges my son might try to mount after I am gone. Alton nodded and typed the stipulations with practiced speed. It was a decision that sent an unexpected wave of peace washing through me. My late wife Dorothea would have wanted it this way. Her father had served overseas and come home carrying deep invisible scars that shadowed him for the rest of his life. Before Dorothea passed away 10 years ago, her dying wish was that we use a meaningful share of the logistics empire I had built to establish a foundation for struggling veterans. I had given her my word, but after I buried her, grief clouded everything. I looked at Colin, 25 years old at the time, and saw the only living piece of Dorothea I had left. I told myself that if I gave him enough time, enough resources, enough support, he would grow into a man capable of stewarding the estate and honoring his mother's legacy. I put off the charity. I kept Colin as the sole heir. I traded my wife's beautiful, selfless final wish for the delusion that my son would eventually grow a conscience. Sitting in that vinyl diner booth, I saw clearly that I had squandered 10 years waiting on a miracle that was never going to come. Colin was not going to build a legacy. He was going to liquidate my life's work to cover luxury car leases and designer wardrobes. Alton turned the tablet around and slid it across the sticky laminate table. The screen showed the dense legal language of the trust amendment. I put on my reading glasses and worked through the paragraphs. The wording was absolute. It legally severed Colin from the $15 million fortune, stating explicitly that he was to receive nothing, effectively disinheriting him and transferring complete control of the estate to the veterans' charity. The second, my heart stops beating. Alton placed a digital stylus in my hand. I need your signature at the bottom, he said quietly. Once you sign it, uploads directly to my firm's secure server and is time-stamped. It becomes legally binding the moment your pen leaves the glass. If Colin or his new attorney attempts to file a competency claim later this afternoon, this timestamp will demonstrate that you executed this amendment before any such motion was ever introduced to a court. It will make their entire strategy look like a desperate retaliatory cash grab. I looked at the glowing signature line waiting for my name. Signing away your only child is not a natural act. It cuts against every instinct a parent carries. For a brief moment, the image of Colin as a small boy broke through, running across the lawn of our first house, laughing as I chased him through the afternoon light. But that boy was gone. The man who had taken his place was at this very moment trying to have me locked in a psychiatric ward so he could take my home. I gripped the stylus and pressed it to the screen. I signed my name in fluid, deliberate strokes. I handed the stylus back to Alton. "It is done," Alton said, pressing a final button on the screen. "The trust is sealed. The house is secure. He has absolutely zero legal standing, and he has no idea what is coming." I nodded and drew a slow, deep breath of diner air. The defensive wall was fully built. The legal shield was in place, and the financial oxygen had been completely cut off. It was time to see the results. I reached into the pocket of my damp overcoat and pulled out my cell phone. It had been powered down since I sat in the back of that taxi outside the mansion, right after I sent that single ominous message about the true ownership of the house. I pressed my thumb against the power button and held it. The screen came to life, the manufacturer logo glowing bright white against the black glass. I set the phone flat on the table between Alton and myself. We both watched it in silence as the operating system slowly loaded. The home screen appeared. For 3 long, motionless seconds, the phone was completely still. The processor stalled, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of data pressing through the cellular network all at once. Then the dam gave way. A sharp, frantic chime cut through the quiet diner, then another. Then a continuous, overlapping cascade of rings, buzzes, and alert tones. The screen lit up like a slot machine hitting a jackpot. 50 separate notifications poured down the glass in rapid succession. 20 missed calls from Colin, 15 from Simone, dozens of text messages written entirely in capital letters and exclamation points, voicemail alerts stacked one on top of another. The financial blockades I had erected earlier that morning had detonated inside their carefully constructed world. Their credit cards had declined. Their accounts were frozen. The panic had taken hold, and the adjustment was entirely beyond their reach. The phone on that sticky diner table did not simply ring. It vibrated with a relentless, almost violent energy, as though the device itself was in the grip of a full breakdown. I sat across from Alton, watching the screen blaze with missed calls, messages, and stacked voicemail alerts. The trap had snapped shut completely. I reached over and picked up the phone. I passed over the flood of threatening texts and opened my voicemail inbox instead. The first message at the top was from Simone. I pressed play and held the speaker to my ear. Her voice was nothing like the cold, indifferent tone she had used when she pushed me out into the freezing rain at 1:00 in the morning. This was a high-pitched, barely contained screech. She was nearly hyperventilating. She demanded to know what I had done to the secondary platinum card. She was standing at the register inside the downtown luxury designer boutique, the very same place where she had attempted to run $8,000 in charges just as the sun came up. Through her ragged breathing, I could make out the soft hum of ambient store music and the murmured apologies of sales associates. Simone screamed that her card had been declined not once, but 3 separate times. And she had not gone alone. She had brought 2 of her high society friends along for a morning shopping trip, women she had spent years working to impress. She was standing at the counter, fully humiliated, holding up the line while the cashier looked at her with poorly concealed pity. She ordered me to call the bank and correct the glitch before she lost her mind entirely. I lowered the phone, and a deep, steady clarity settled over me. Simone's obsession with appearances had always been her most profound vulnerability. It was her Achilles heel. When she first appeared in Colin's life, I watched her eyes move around every room she entered, quietly calculating the net worth of everyone in it. She had constructed a digital existence built on private jets and imported champagne, every bit of it underwritten by my labor. She had not married Colin because he was a kind man or a driven partner. She married him for the aesthetic of wealth, the mansion, the cars, the unlimited access to a life she had never come close to earning. To have her polished image crack apart in public in front of the exact women she had spent years trying to reign over, that was a fate worse than any financial consequence for a woman like her. The mask had shattered, and she was bleeding socially. I deleted her message and moved to the next voicemail. It was from Colin. Where Simone's message had been pure panic, my son's was something closer to unhinged rage. I heard his heavy, controlled breathing dissolve into barely suppressed fury as he demanded I switch my phone back on immediately. His voice trembled with a volatile mixture of anger and rising terror. He told me his credit lines were frozen, and the bank was blocking all transfers from the operational account. He threatened that if I did not reverse this at once, he would instruct his lawyers to push forward with the emergency guardianship filing. He ended the message shouting that I was destroying his life. I set the phone face down on the table. He still believed he held the upper hand. He still believed his conservatorship threats held real power. He had no idea that Alton had already legally severed him from the $15 million estate. The humiliating reality of financial ruin was arriving at his doorstep, yet he was still trying to bluster his way past it. Alton watched me from the other side of the booth, his expression steady and unreadable. He lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, and gave a single quiet nod. The financial ecosystem they lived in has collapsed, Alton said, his voice low. They are suffocating, and they are looking for someone to blame. I reached into my leather briefcase and drew out my silver tablet. I needed to see exactly how that collapse was unfolding in real time. I unlocked the screen and opened the secure application tied directly to the mansion's exterior camera network. That state-of-the-art surveillance system had been installed with my money meant to protect my family. Now, I was using it to watch their world come apart. I pulled up the live feed for the main driveway, the one trained on the heavy wrought iron front gates. The winter rain was still coming down hard, smearing the lens at the edges, but the picture was clear enough to see what mattered. A large, heavy-duty vehicle rolled into the frame. Not a delivery van, not a neighbor's luxury sedan. It was a sleek flatbed tow truck, its amber warning lights slicing through the gray morning fog. I watched in absolute silence as the heavy iron gates, which I had intentionally unlinked from Colin's control panel earlier that morning, swung open automatically, admitting the truck onto the property. It crawled up the long, manicured driveway and headed straight for the front of the mansion, where Colin's imported luxury SUV sat waiting. The consequences of my morning phone calls were arriving precisely on schedule. I kept my gaze fixed on the glowing screen. The high-definition cameras I had placed around the mansion's perimeter gave a crystal-clear view of the front drive. The winter storm had not eased. Freezing rain hammered the cobblestones. The flatbed sat idling in the center of the driveway, its heavy diesel engine throwing off a steady, thick ribbon of white exhaust that drifted past the manicured hedges I once trimmed myself. The driver climbed out of the cab and pulled the collar of his neon high-visibility jacket tight against the biting wind. He walked straight toward the gleaming black SUV parked near the front portico. That vehicle was Colin's prized possession. It was what he drove to his elite social clubs to project the unmistakable image of a self-made corporate titan, a rolling monument to his manufactured success. And now, a man in a rain-soaked jacket was dragging a heavy steel chain across the wet asphalt, preparing to hook it to the front axle. Watching those thick metal hooks latch onto that ridiculously expensive car's undercarriage pulled a sharp and particular memory to the surface. 10 years ago, when Colin landed his very first entry-level job out of college, I wanted to set him up for lifelong success. I went to a reputable local dealership and bought him a perfectly solid, sensible sedan. I paid for it entirely in cash. I handed him the keys and told him that a man who owns his car outright answers to no one. I wanted him to understand the quiet pride of debt-free ownership. Exactly 3 months later, he drove that reliable, practical car straight to a luxury foreign dealership. He traded it in as a mere down payment on a leased high-performance sports car he absolutely could not afford. That one arrogant decision locked him into an endless cycle of toxic debt. He gladly surrendered his financial freedom for the hollow illusion of status. Today, that illusion was being towed away. On the screen, the winch motor began to grind. The front wheels of the luxury vehicle lifted slowly off the wet pavement, tilting at a steep angle. Then the heavy oak front doors of the mansion burst open. Colin came sprinting out onto the wide porch wearing nothing but a navy terry cloth bathrobe and a pair of worn house shoes. He didn't even register the freezing rain soaking through his clothes and plastering his hair flat against his forehead. He flung his arms wildly at the tow truck driver, screaming at the top of his lungs. Even with the audio feed off, his body language told the whole story. He was demanding the driver drop the car immediately, waving both hands, jabbing a finger at the house, probably shouting about a bank error or a case of mistaken identity. The tow truck driver didn't flinch. He was a seasoned professional who had faced hundreds of irate entitled debtors before. He simply shook his head, produced a laminated work order from his jacket pocket, and pointed firmly at the paperwork. The automatic payment had failed. The premium insurance policy had been abruptly canceled. The vehicle was a substantial financial liability, and the bank wanted their property back immediately. The driver turned his back on my screaming son and walked to the controls to finish securing the chains. Behind Colin, standing in the grand entryway of the mansion, was Simone. She was wrapped in a thick cashmere sweater, gripping a heavy stoneware mug of coffee with both hands. Her posture was rigid. Her face had gone remarkably pale, completely stripped of its usual arrogant, mocking smirk. She was watching her husband debase himself in the driveway, but her eyes kept sweeping nervously across the property. She was watching the neighborhood wake up. The tow truck's flashing amber lights were bouncing off the dark windows of the surrounding multi-million-dollar estates. The wealthy neighbors she spent every waking hour trying to impress were undoubtedly peering through their expensive blinds, witnessing the very public collapse of her perfect facade. Simone stepped slowly backward, retreating into the deep shadows of the foyer. Knowing her carefully constructed social standing was dying, in plain sight she did not go out to stand beside her husband. She left him to the rain. Colin threw his hands in the air, pacing back and forth across the wet driveway. He pointed an accusatory finger at the tow truck driver, one final time, then aggressively yanked his phone from his wet bathrobe pocket. He began stabbing at the screen with his thumb, his face twisted in raw desperation and helpless fury. He was searching for the one person who had always cleaned up his disasters. He was reaching for his permanent safety net. He needed the old man to make this go away. I watched him press the phone to his ear on the tablet screen. Exactly 1 second later, the device sitting on the diner table between Alton and me began to vibrate. The screen lit up, displaying Colin's name. Alton glanced at the ringing phone, then looked back up at me with a raised eyebrow, asking the question without words. The Greasy Spoon Diner carried on its ordinary morning routine around us. The clink of cheap silverware and the low murmur of tired truck drivers formed a stark, surreal contrast to the financial destruction playing out on my screen. I did not reach for the phone. I settled back into the vinyl booth and let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. I watched Colin pacing in the freezing rain on the camera feed, shoulders hunched against the cold, his free hand clutching his wet hair in the total panic. I reached across the sticky laminate table and picked up the phone. I pressed the green button to accept the call. I raised it to my ear, and I did not say a single word. I simply sat there breathing softly, holding the line open, completely silent. I let the devastating weight of his situation carry itself across the digital gap between us. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the frantic, ragged sound of my son breathing on the other end of the line. The noise of the diner seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the live transmission of Colin's complete unraveling. He was hyperventilating short, panicked gasps, as though he were physically drowning in the freezing rain I had just watched him stand in moments before. "Dad, you need to fix this right now." His voice was a taut wire pulled to its absolute limit. "The tow truck driver is not listening to me. The bank is telling me my accounts are locked. Simone is screaming at me. You need to transfer the money back immediately. Turn the cards back on. You are ruining my life." I sat perfectly still in the vinyl booth and listened, as his demands escalated from pleading to outright commands. He did not ask how I was holding up after being driven from my own home in the dead of night. He offered no apology for Simone's behavior, nor for his own spineless silence throughout it all. His entire world was caving in around him, and, in his mind, I was nothing more than a negligent caretaker who had stopped maintaining his luxury simulation. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I made no attempt to explain the legal maneuvers Alton and I had just finalized. I simply drew the phone away from my ear, glanced at the call timer ticking upward on the glowing screen, and pressed the red button. The line went dead. I slid the phone into my coat pocket, thanked Alton for his swift and precise legal work, and walked out of the diner. The freezing winter rain was still falling in heavy sheets, washing the grime from the industrial streets. I got into my rental car and covered the short distance back to the cheap highway motel. When I pushed through the thin, hollow door of my room, a wave of stale, damp air hit me. The place smelled of harsh chemical cleaner and old cigarette smoke, doing a poor job of masking years of neglect. I peeled off my wet overcoat and draped it over the back of the plastic desk chair. I sat down on the edge of the sagging mattress, felt the broken springs push into my back, and looked around at the peeling wallpaper and the fluorescent bulb flickering above the bathroom sink. and I felt something unexpected, a sudden powerful wave of nostalgia. This dingy, dispiriting room did not make me feel beaten. It carried me back 40 years to when I was a young man in my 30s trying to build my logistics company from a single rusted delivery van into a viable regional fleet. I had lived in rooms exactly like this one. I had spent countless nights on terrible mattresses just off the interstate, pulling thin blankets tight against the cold so I could save every penny that was worth saving. I ate cold canned soup for dinner so I could make payroll for my drivers the next morning. I worked until my hands bled and my spine ached, breathing in diesel fumes and cheap motel soap for the better part of a decade. I built a $15 million empire on a foundation of relentless grinding sacrifice. Outside, the rain intensified, driving against the single-pane glass with a steady drumming rhythm. It was the same kind of bitter, freezing rain I had pushed through decades ago, hauling freight across state lines, while the rest of the world slept warm in their beds. I had endured that biting cold so my family would never have to shiver. I had worn down my own comfort piece by piece to build a fortress of security around my wife and my son. And this was my reward, a son who regarded my life's work as nothing more than a bank account to be drained. A son who would lock me out in the very cold I had spent a lifetime shielding him from. Colin had never seen that version of me. By the time he was old enough to grasp the world, the empire was already standing. He grew up inside the sprawling suburban mansion, sleeping on imported silk sheets and eating meals laid out by private caterers. He had always assumed that wealth was a birthright, some ambient resource that simply existed in the air, available to be drawn upon without thought. He was currently squandering the very empire I had traded my youth to construct, and doing it with a breathtaking absence of gratitude. The sharp contrast between my early years in rooms like this one and his current entitled meltdown only deepened the cold resolve settling in my chest. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I needed to make certain my digital trail had been completely erased. I moved through the privacy settings and felt a jolt of frustration. I had forgotten to disable the location sharing feature. Colin had insisted on linking our family accounts years ago, framing it as a matter of safety. I toggled the setting off, immediately severing the tracking signal. But as I watched the icon vanish from the top of the screen, a heavy realization came over me. He had been staring at his phone in full panic for the better part of the last hour. If he had checked the location app before I cut it off, he already had my last known position. I set the phone on the nightstand and waited. I did not switch on the television. I did not pace the room. I simply sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the rain, work against the cheap glass, gathering myself for the physical confrontation I knew was coming. 2 hours went by in complete silence. Then the stillness of the motel room was split apart by a violent explosive noise. It was not a polite knock. It was heavy, aggressive pounding that rattled the thin wooden door in its cheap metal frame. The force of the blows actually shook the flimsy security chain, holding the door from the inside. I did not flinch. I rose slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my trousers. I moved toward the door, my footsteps quiet on the damp carpet. I did not reach for the handle. I stood perfectly still and let him burn through his first wave of fury. The pounding stopped for a brief moment, replaced by the sound of hard, frantic breathing seeping through the narrow hallway outside. Then my son's voice came booming through the thin wood, loud enough for half the motel to hear. "Open up. I know you were in there. I tracked your phone before you turned it off." He hammered his fist against the door again, the wood groaning under the impact. He had dropped any pretense of being a concerned son. He was a desperate, cornered animal, and his true nature was bleeding through every single word. "Open this door right now. I am your legal guardian. You are sick, Dad, and you need to give me the account passwords before I call the police and have you dragged out of here." I stood mere inches from the door, listening to him weaponize my age and my health in a pathetic bid to reclaim access to my money. He genuinely believed he could intimidate me. He believed that shouting legal threats through a cheap motel door would crack my resolve. He had absolutely no idea that the man standing on the other side of this door was not a frail, helpless victim. I was the architect of his destruction, and I was entirely prepared to open that door and let reality land squarely in his face. I unhooked the cheap metal chain and turned the deadbolt. The click sounded unnaturally loud inside the small, cramped room. I pulled the heavy door open just far enough to fill the threshold, blocking the entrance with my body. The frigid winter air rushed in at once, carrying the bitter smell of wet asphalt, damp clothing, and cheap exhaust from the nearby highway. Colin stood in the narrow exterior hallway, shivering hard. He looked absolutely pitiful. He was no longer in a navy terry cloth bathrobe and worn house shoes. He had hastily thrown a wrinkled designer overcoat over a pair of sweatpants and stepped into expensive leather loafers that the freezing rain was steadily destroying. His hair was plastered flat to his forehead, and his chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. He made a sudden aggressive lunge forward, trying to use his size and momentum to push straight past me into the room. I did not move a single inch. I planted my feet on the faded motel carpet and fixed my eyes on his. For just a fraction of a second, he looked genuinely startled that a 72-year-old man could hold his ground so squarely against someone half his age. He stumbled back slightly, wiping cold rain from his face, his arrogance momentarily faltering. "You need to pack your things right now," Colin demanded, his voice vibrating with a toxic mixture of panic and hollow authority. "I am taking you back to the house. You are clearly having some kind of severe psychological episode. You froze my accounts and canceled the insurance policies because you are confused. You do not even know what you are doing." I held his gaze and said nothing, letting his desperate lies hang in the freezing air between us. He was attempting to gaslight me directly to my face. He genuinely believed he could reshape reality by simply declaring his delusions out loud. It was a tactic that had served him well with Simone, with his wealthy associates, and with his business contacts for years. But he was forgetting that I was the man who had taught him how to speak. When I gave him no response, his tone sharpened further. He leveled a trembling, rain-soaked finger at my chest. "If you do not give me the passwords to unlock the operational accounts, right this second, I am calling my lawyers. I already spoke to them this morning." What comes next is the moment everything tilts. My son believed he still held the upper hand, that I was cornered, powerless, finished. He had no idea what had already been set in motion against him. "Before we get there, let me ask you this. If someone you raised and loved had been quietly working to destroy you, would you warn them first or let the consequences speak for themselves? We are filing an emergency competency lawsuit today. A judge will look at what you did this morning, canceling everything without warning, and declare you completely unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be placed under my legal guardianship by the end of the week. You will have no control over anything." He stood there shivering in his ruined designer shoes, waiting for me to break. He expected me to buckle under the terrifying prospect of losing my autonomy. He expected the old man to apologize, lower his head, and surrender the keys to the kingdom, just as I had done in the hollow aftermath of his mother's passing. I looked at the son I had raised. I looked at the man who had spent his entire adult life consuming everything I offered and demanding still more. A profound, icy calm settled deep into my bones. The fear he was trying to plant in me simply glanced off the armor I had built over the preceding hours. "I do not need a psychological evaluation, Colin," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady register that cut cleanly through the sound of the falling rain. "What I need is a son who is not drowning in a $60,000 illegal sports betting debt in Las Vegas." The color drained from his face instantly. The arm he had been jabbing aggressively toward my chest slowly fell to his side as though the muscles had simply given out. The arrogant, combative posture dissolved, entirely replaced by the terrified stance of a cornered thief whose darkest secret had just been hauled into the open air. He parted his lips to speak, but nothing came out. I did not give him a moment to recover. I leaned slightly forward, making certain he caught every syllable clearly above the noise of the storm. A year ago, I noticed strange discrepancies in the joint operational accounts, large unexplained cash withdrawals, wire transfers routed to obscure shell companies. I did not want to believe my own flesh and blood was stealing from the family. I desperately needed to be wrong. So I hired a private investigator, quietly hoping he would clear your name and prove that my suspicions were nothing more than the paranoid delusions of a grieving old man. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as the full weight of my words landed. Instead, the investigator delivered a towering record of your illegal debt. I continued, keeping my tone completely stripped of emotion. "I know about the offshore betting accounts. I know about the aggressive, unsavory lenders you owe money to. I know that you have been using my logistics fortune to frantically paper over your gambling losses while performing the role of a self-made titan at your exclusive country club. You did not come to this motel today because you are worried about my mental health. You came here because you are absolutely terrified that the people you owe money to are going to break your legs when you default on your payments this coming Friday. The freezing wind pushed through the open doorway, but Colin was sweating. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow heaves as his mind scrambled for footing. He had climbed those motel steps believing he held the ultimate advantage. He thought the threat of a forced conservatorship would drive me into submission. Instead, I had just laid his most guarded, dangerous secrets out on the cold concrete walkway for anyone passing by to hear. For a long, agonizing moment, we simply stared at one another. I watched the last traces of the boy I had raised evaporate into the winter air. The illusion of the dutiful, loving son was gone for good. The mask came away entirely, exposing the ruthless, desperate creature hiding beneath it. A slow, dark sneer spread across his rain-soaked face. Twisting his features into something so venomous and ugly, he looked like a stranger. "You think you are so incredibly smart," Colin spat, his voice thick with unfiltered malice. "You think cutting off the credit cards and freezing the bank accounts is going to stop me. Keep your cash, old man. I do not need your operational funds anymore." He stepped back, pulling his wet overcoat tight around his shoulders. He fixed me with a triumphant, mocking glare that sent a brief ripple of anticipation through my gut. "I have already listed the mansion for a private cash sale." He sneered, his lips curling into a wicked, greedy smile. "It is the family estate, and it is in my name as your only heir. I have wealthy cash buyers touring the property right now as we speak. I will have $2 million in liquid cash wired directly into my personal accounts by Friday afternoon. You can sit in this filthy motel room and rot for all I care. The house is mine." He pivoted on his heel, his ruined leather shoes splashing through the deep puddles on the concrete walkway. He did not look back. He pushed off into the gray winter storm, leaving me alone in the doorway of the cheap motel. I watched him vanish into the weather. He truly believed he had claimed his ultimate victory, that he had found a brilliant loophole to slip around my financial blockade and strip the crown jewel from the empire I had spent my life building. I eased the heavy wooden door shut, sealing out the freezing rain and the fading sound of his footsteps. I crossed back to the small laminate desk and picked up my phone to call Alton. The final trap had just been sprung. I stood in the center of that cramped motel room, listening to the rain pound the thin window glass while my son's parting words echoed off the peeling wallpaper. He had declared with absolute arrogance that he had already listed my mansion for a private cash sale, that $2 million would be sitting in his personal accounts by Friday afternoon. I moved to the small desk and lowered myself into the hard plastic chair. I did not let the panic overtake my thinking. I opened my laptop and woke the screen, its harsh blue glow filling the dark room. I dialed Alton's direct line. He picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice perfectly level as I walked him through everything that had just transpired on the concrete walkway outside my door. Colin's desperate physical state, his ruined designer clothes, and the venomous threat he had made about the estate. I told Alton that my son claimed the house was already on the active market and that cash buyers were walking the property at that very moment. Over the line, I heard the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard as Alton worked through what I was telling him. He said it sounded like a frantic bluff designed to pressure me into unfreezing Colin's credit lines. I told Alton that my son was a creature of desperate vanity, and that he would absolutely move to liquidate anything within reach to keep his gambling creditors at bay. I instructed Alton to search the active high-end real estate networks for our specific county. We stayed on the line without speaking, as we both pulled up the most exclusive property portals in the region. I typed in the address of the sprawling suburban estate I had called home for decades. The results loaded immediately. My stomach tightened into a sharp, painful knot as a high-resolution photograph of my own wrought iron front gates filled the laptop screen. He had not been bluffing at all. The mansion was actively listed and open for business. I clicked through to the property profile and began scrolling through the details. The listing price was absurdly low, deliberately slashed to a fraction of the true market value to guarantee a fast, unquestioned transaction. The bold text in the description read, "Gifted family estate available for rapid cash sale only." The real estate copy was written with a sickening veneer of charm. It boasted about the pristine Italian marble floors I had imported for my wife and the custom crystal chandeliers she had chosen with such deliberate care. It highlighted the manicured grounds where I had planted roses in her memory. The listing agent promised a seamless closing for the right cash buyer. My own son was publicly attempting to sell off the last standing monument to his mother's memory, fencing it like a stolen watch at a pawn counter just to settle his illicit debts. A wave of nausea moved through me as the full ease of his willingness to erase our history became clear. I read the listing details aloud to Alton over the phone. He let out a low, humorless laugh and asked whether my son had completely lost his grip on reality. I told Alton that Colin had simply operated under a lifetime of unchecked delusion. For years, he had lived inside that massive house, hosting lavish gatherings and performing the role of wealthy lord of the manor for his circle of elite friends. He assumed that, because I had allowed him to treat the property as his own, he possessed some inherent automatic claim to it. He genuinely believed that as my only child, the physical deed belonged to him the instant he decided he needed the money. He was catastrophically wrong. I explained to Alton that my son had completely overlooked the foundational legal structure underlying our family assets. The deed to that magnificent house had never been in my personal name, and it was certainly never going to be in his. The property was held exclusively by the Dorothea Whitlow Trust. When I purchased that estate years ago, I placed it inside a secure ironclad trust named after my late wife, precisely to guard it against this kind of reckless financial behavior. My son could post the house on every listing site in the country, but he had no legal authority to sell so much as a blade of grass from that front lawn. I told Alton we needed to contact the listing broker immediately and shut this whole circus down before anyone actually put pen to paper, but Alton told me to wait. The clicking of his keyboard grew faster and considerably more urgent. He said he was digging into the public county clerk database to find out exactly what documentation my son had provided to the real estate agency to get the listing approved in the first place. Any reputable broker would normally demand airtight proof of ownership before marketing a multi-million-dollar property to the public. The silence on the phone stretched into a long, agonizing minute. The only sound in that miserable motel room was the steady rattle of the old wall heater fighting a losing battle against the winter cold outside. Then Alton spoke, and his voice had lost every trace of its usual composed professionalism. There was real alarm in his tone. He told me to refresh the real estate page and look at the document attachments section at the very bottom of the property listing. I scrolled down and clicked a small blue link labeled Legal Disclosures. A scanned document opened on my screen. It was not a property deed. It was an official filing from the county family court. I read through the dense legal language and my blood went absolutely cold. My son had not merely listed the house behind my back. He had filed an emergency injunction early that morning, while I was busy freezing his credit cards. The document submitted under strict penalty of perjury claimed I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. The fraudulent filing asserted that I was experiencing violent, unpredictable psychotic episodes and posed an immediate danger to myself and everyone in my presence. It portrayed a shattered, sick old man who could no longer be trusted with his own basic care. But the final paragraph was the most terrifying thing I had ever read in my 72 years on this earth. It formally petitioned the county court to grant my son immediate temporary power of attorney over all my medical and financial decisions. He was moving to bypass the secure trust entirely by having me legally declared a mental incompetent, seizing total control over every dimension of my existence. The cramped motel room suddenly felt like a closing trap. I stared at the legal document on my laptop screen. My own son had filed an emergency injunction in county family court, claiming I was a violent danger to myself and suffering from advanced dementia. He was actively petitioning a judge to strip away my basic human rights and hand him absolute authority over my physical and financial life. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Alton did not waste a single moment in shock. He shut his laptop and pushed it into his leather briefcase. He looked at me with undisguised urgency and told me we were in a race against the clock. If a sympathetic judge signed that emergency order before hearing our side, my son could legally dispatch police to this very motel to collect me and have me committed to a psychiatric facility. We needed unassailable medical proof of my competence, and we needed it immediately. I grabbed my damp overcoat and followed Alton out into the freezing winter storm. The drive to the city medical center was tense and wordless. The tires of Alton's sedan hissed across the flooded asphalt, while the wipers struggled against the heavy downpour. I watched the gray city blur past the passenger window. A deep, heavy sorrow settled into my bones. Aging is a strange and cruel process. You spend your entire life constructing an empire, carrying the weight of hundreds of employees, managing intricate logistics operations. Your mind a sharp instrument that works through crises daily. Yet the moment your hair turns white and your stride slows, the world decides you are a target. Your own flesh and blood looks at your decades of hard-earned wisdom and sees nothing but a weakened mark ripe to be taken. My son was weaponizing my age against me, using the simple passage of time as an instrument of theft. I tightened my grip on the door handle, refusing to let his malicious fiction become my reality. We pulled up to the towering glass and steel medical complex at the heart of the city. We moved quickly through the bright, sterile lobby, bypassing the crowded waiting areas, and took the elevator straight up to the private executive health wing on the top floor. We were there to see Dr. Stroud. He was the chief of internal medicine and had been my primary physician for over 30 years. More than that, he was the man who had stood beside me through the darkest chapter of my life. 10 years ago, when my wife Dorothea was fighting her final losing battle against illness, Dr. Stroud had managed her care. He spent countless hours in our hospital room, walking us through treatment options and offering genuine human comfort when the medicine stopped working. He knew the full depth of my grief and the full measure of my character. He knew without question that my mind was sharper than most men half my age. Dr. Stroud was reviewing patient files in his spacious corner office when his receptionist showed us in. He looked up surprised by the unannounced visit, but his expression shifted immediately to deep concern when he read the gravity on our faces. Alton stepped forward and laid out the dire legal situation in clear, direct terms. He described the fraudulent court filing and explained that we needed a comprehensive expedited cognitive evaluation conducted on the spot, a signed notarized medical certificate establishing that I was entirely competent and in full command of my mental faculties. Dr. Stroud did not ask unnecessary questions. He recognized the weight of the threat and immediately cleared his schedule for the next hour. I settled into the stiff leather examination chair, while Dr. Stroud produced a standard cognitive assessment protocol. For the next 45 minutes, I submitted to a rigorous mental examination. It was deeply humiliating being made to prove my own sanity simply because a greedy son wanted to fund his way out of a gambling debt. But I channeled the anger rising in my chest into absolute total focus. I worked through complex mathematical equations without hesitation. I recalled long sequences of random numbers in both directions. I reproduced intricate geometric shapes from memory and dismantled logical puzzles with the same focused efficiency I had once applied to negotiating corporate freight contracts. I did not stumble once. My mind moved like a precisely calibrated instrument, cutting cleanly through every task. When the evaluation was finished, Dr. Stroud set his clipboard down on his desk, looked at me with a warm, steady smile, and told me that my cognitive function was not merely normal, it was exceptional. He turned to his computer and composed a thorough medical declaration detailing every result from the examination. He printed it on official hospital letterhead and signed his name at the bottom with a heavy black pen. Alton took the document immediately and secured it inside his briefcase. The legal shield was forged. We now held the definitive weapon to dismantle the fraudulent court injunction and protect my autonomy. The crushing pressure that had gripped my chest since I first saw that real estate listing began to ease. I rose and extended my hand to thank Dr. Stroud for setting everything aside to come to my aid. But as he shook it, the professional warmth drained from his expression completely. He gestured for Alton and me to return to the chairs across from his desk. The atmosphere in that bright office suddenly felt very thick and very cold. Dr. Stroud removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, looking deeply troubled. He looked directly at me and spoke in a low, measured voice that sent a fresh current of ice straight through my chest. He said he was glad we had come to see him today because there was something profoundly disturbing he needed to share with me. He drew a slow breath and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "Your son came into this very office 3 days ago. Your son came into this very office 3 days ago." Dr. Stroud said, his words dropping like stones into the quiet room. "He requested a private consultation regarding your health. He sat right where you are sitting now and told me you were completely losing your mind. He claimed you were becoming violent and that he needed to protect the family. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick envelope of cash, and offered me $10,000 on the spot to falsify a medical record and officially diagnose you with severe advanced dementia. Walking out of the medical center, I felt a profound shift take hold deep in my chest. The sorrow of a betrayed father was swept aside, entirely replaced by the cold calculation of a businessman preparing for a hostile takeover. Dr. Stroud had provided official medical clearance and a signed affidavit laying out my son's attempt to purchase a fraudulent dementia diagnosis for $10,000. Alton secured both documents inside his leather briefcase. The legal shield was now reinforced with absolute proof of criminal intent. We climbed back into my attorney's sedan. The winter storm had finally begun to loosen its grip, leaving behind a cold, flat gray afternoon. I told Alton to drive directly to the main branch of my primary bank in the financial district. I needed the ultimate instrument to demolish the delusional real estate listing my son had posted online. We bypassed the crowded teller lines and were escorted down to the secure vault area in the basement. The heavy steel door of the vault swung open with a resonant click that echoed through the quiet metallic corridor. I walked the aisle and located my personal safety deposit box. I slid my key into the lock and drew out the long metal drawer. Inside, resting beneath a stack of old corporate bonds and tax records, was a thick manila envelope. I opened it and pulled out the original physical deed to the suburban mansion. The heavy parchment felt substantial and rough under my fingertips. Holding it sent a sudden rush of vivid memory through me. I recalled the exact afternoon I had signed this document decades ago. I had just closed my first major international freight contract. I bought the estate outright in cash to give my late wife Dorothea the sprawling garden she had always dreamed of, and I made certain the deed was placed directly into a secure trust to protect her future and shield our family from outside threats. This piece of parchment was not simply a record of property. It was the physical embodiment of my entire legacy. Holding it now, it did not feel like a keepsake from the past. It felt like a loaded weapon. I set the original deed down to the private viewing table inside the vault room. Alton opened his briefcase and laid the rest of our arsenal out carefully beside it. We arranged the documents side by side beneath the bright fluorescent lights. We had the irrevocable trust amendment severing my son from the estate completely. We had the unassailable medical certificate from the chief of internal medicine confirming my full cognitive competence. We had the sworn affidavit detailing the criminal attempt to bribe a medical professional. And now we had the original watermarked physical deed proving that my son held absolutely no legal right to sell my home. Alton looked down at the precisely assembled legal portfolio and gave a slow nod. His professional composure gave way briefly to an expression of genuine predatory satisfaction. He told me we held enough documented evidence not only to demolish the fraudulent conservatorship injunction, but to have my son arrested for criminal conspiracy and fraud. We gathered the papers, secured them inside a heavy binder, and left the bank vault ready to execute the final move. We returned to the car and sat in the leather seats with the engine running, the heater pushing warm air through the cabin. Alton opened his silver tablet to review the legal filing schedule. His plan was to submit the medical clearance and the trust amendment to the county clerk without delay. That action would effectively neutralize the emergency family court injunction my son had filed that morning. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard, aware that we were about to dismantle my son's entire constructed world before the sun went down. Just as Alton opened the digital portal to begin uploading the files, a sharp alert chime cut through the quiet cabin. It was a push notification from the exclusive real estate application Alton had downloaded earlier that morning to track the active listing on my mansion. He tapped the banner, his eyes moving quickly across the updated property profile. I watched his jaw tighten. The trace of satisfaction left his face entirely replaced by sudden focused urgency. He turned the tablet toward me. My son had not simply left the property sitting online to gather digital inquiries. He had aggressively escalated his timeline to liquidate the estate. A bright red banner now stretched across the top of the listing. The text announced that the property was hosting an exclusive invitation-only open house strictly for verified cash buyers and private investment groups seeking an immediate expedited closing. My son was actively trying to fence my home that very day. He was working to lock in a substantial non-refundable cash deposit before the weekend arrived, desperate to use that stolen capital to settle his gambling debts in Las Vegas. I leaned in to read the event details, and my stomach dropped. The private showing was not scheduled for tomorrow. It was not set for that evening. The text stated clearly that the open house was due to begin in exactly 1 hour. The wealthy buyers were already on their way. They were heading to my home, prepared to walk across my imported marble floors and negotiate a fraudulent cash deal with a man who did not own a single brick of the foundation. Alton dropped the tablet onto the passenger seat and shifted the car immediately into gear. There was no time to sit in a parking lot uploading documents through a slow county clerk portal. If my son accepted a cash deposit from a private buyer, it would create a tangled legal disaster that could take years to unravel in civil court. We had to stop the transaction at its source. We had to confront the delusion head-on. The legal guillotine was fully assembled, and it was time to drop the blade. I watched the city streets sweep past the passenger window as Alton steered the sedan away from the financial district, guiding us toward the affluent retail corridor where the most prestigious businesses in the city operated. The winter storm clouds were finally beginning to separate overhead, but the atmosphere inside the car remained tightly coiled. We were not heading to the mansion just yet. If we were going to tear down my son's illusion completely, we needed to start with the enablers who had propped it up. We pulled in front of a sleek glass and steel building housing the most exclusive luxury real estate brokerage in the county. This was the agency my son had chosen to market my home, the firm currently facilitating the fraudulent open house relying on forged documents and an unquestioning faith in my son's manufactured social credentials. I stepped out of the car and buttoned my damp overcoat. My boots struck the wet pavement with slow, deliberate weight. Stepping through the pristine glass doors of the brokerage, I was immediately hit by the thick scent of expensive leather and artisan coffee. The lobby was engineered to make ordinary people feel small, soaring ceilings, massive digital displays, cycling endlessly through multi-million-dollar listings, every surface chosen to project an almost aggressive sense of wealth. A young receptionist behind a vast slab of imported marble looked up and offered us a practiced, condescending smile. She asked politely whether we had an appointment with an agent. Alton did not slow his stride. He walked straight to her desk, placed both hands flat on the marble surface, and told her we were not there to schedule a property tour. He instructed her to bring the managing broker out immediately and to inform him that the true legal owner of the Whitlow estate had arrived. The receptionist's practiced smile vanished at once. She reached for her desk phone and murmured a few rushed words into the receiver. Less than a minute later, a tall man in a tailored Italian suit emerged from a frosted glass office at the back of the room. He moved toward us, projecting an air of complete authority, his gold name badge identifying him as Mr. Pemberton Sr., managing partner of the firm. He looked first at Alton, then shifted his gaze to me. I watched a remarkable transformation unfold in real time. Pemberton stopped dead in the middle of the lobby floor. The smooth, dismissive smile fell from his face entirely. He blinked several times, staring at me as though a ghost had just walked through his front door. He was not looking at a confused, senile old man. Pemberton was old school, the kind of businessman who had spent decades serving the true financial elite of this city. He devoured the local business journals cover to cover. He knew precisely who I was. He recognized the man who had built a massive regional logistics empire from a single rusted truck and commanded the commercial freight industry for 40 years. He understood that my name carried the full weight of absolute untouchable success. Mr. Whitlow, Pemberton said, his voice dropping an octave, every trace of arrogance dissolving from it at once. It is a profound honor to meet you, sir. I read your feature in the Trade Gazette years ago. I did not return his pleasantries. I fixed him with a cold, unyielding stare and told him we needed his private conference room right now. Pemberton swallowed hard and immediately escorted us into a soundproof glass office overlooking the busy street below. He shut the heavy door and moved to offer coffee, but Alton cut him off before the words were fully formed. Alton unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and began setting our ammunition directly onto the polished conference table, not a word spoken, as he laid out the undeniable evidence piece by piece. First came the printed medical certificate from the Chief of Internal Medicine, establishing my complete cognitive soundness beyond any dispute. Next, he placed the irrevocable trust amendment legally severing my son from the entire $15 million estate. Finally, I reached into my coat pocket and drew out the thick manila envelope from the bank vault. I slid the original watermarked physical deed to the suburban mansion across the table and told Pemberton to look very carefully at the name printed on the master deed. Pemberton leaned over the table. The color drained slowly from his face until he looked pale and visibly sick. Within seconds, he understood that he had made a catastrophic error. He had allowed his junior agents to list a multi-million-dollar property on nothing but the fraudulent claims of a desperate gambling addict, had extended my son that trust simply because Colin arrived in a leased luxury sports car and wore expensive watches. I kept my voice perfectly level as I laid out the full magnitude of his mistake. I told Pemberton that my son was currently hosting a private cash-only open house at my estate under the banner of his brokerage. I explained that Colin held absolutely zero legal right to sell my home, and that any contract his firm had drawn up would constitute active participation in a massive federal fraud. I told him that my son had filed a malicious family court injunction, alleging I was suffering from severe dementia, yet the medical document resting on his table proved the precise opposite. Pemberton began to sweat. Small beads of moisture gathered on his forehead as the full scope of destruction this scandal could bring crashing down on his prestigious agency became clear. A multi-million-dollar fraud case splashed across the local news would obliterate his reputation and permanently cost him his professional real estate license. He stammered out a pathetic apology, claiming his agency had simply relied on the paperwork Colin had originally provided. I leaned forward and told him that trusting a liar is a very expensive habit, and that by sunset I would be pressing full criminal charges against every party involved in the unauthorized marketing of my property. Panic took hold of Pemberton completely. He understood he was standing on a sinking ship and needed to stop the transaction before a wealthy buyer handed my son a non-refundable cash deposit. He lunged across the desk and grabbed his desktop telephone. His hands were shaking as he hit the speaker button, preparing to dial the mansion and order his junior agents to shut down the open house and pull the listing from the public network immediately. Before he could finish dialing, Alton reached across the table. He placed his large firm hand directly over Pemberton's trembling fingers and stopped him from pressing the final digit. Alton looked at the terrified managing broker and smiled cold and unhurried. "Do not call him," Alton said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried off the glass walls. "We would inform him personally." Pemberton slowly withdrew his hand from the telephone, the absolute finality of the moment perfectly understood. He nodded, his face entirely drained of color, and settled back heavily into his leather chair. We left the document copies on the table as a stark reminder of his extreme liability. I turned my back on the trembling broker and walked out of the office with Alton at my side. We moved through the glass building and stepped back out into the cold afternoon air. The enablers had been thoroughly neutralized, terrified into absolute submission. My son's protective bubble had been stripped away completely, leaving him fully exposed. We returned to the sedan and Alton turned the engine over. The drive to the estate would take under 20 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city streets give way to the affluent suburban roads I had traveled for decades. I was not the same man who had climbed into a damp taxi and fled this neighborhood at 1:00 in the morning. I was returning as the sole architect of my own legacy. I was returning to bring the heavy blade of reality down directly onto the neck of my son's arrogance. I glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. The private open house was already underway. Wealthy buyers were walking across my floors, sipping champagne and discussing closing costs with a man who owned absolutely nothing. We were going to walk through those heavy oak doors and show every last one of them the undeniable truth. The drive from the luxury real estate brokerage to my suburban estate took exactly 18 minutes. Alton guided the sedan through winding tree-lined roads, marking the transition from the bustling city into the ultra-affluent neighborhoods of the county. I sat watching the familiar manicured lawns and stone walls blur past my window. I had traveled this exact route thousands of times across 2 decades. Usually, I was coming back from a grueling day, managing freight logistics, looking forward to the quiet sanctuary I had built for my wife. Today, I was returning as an executioner. We turned onto my street, and the full reality of my son's desperate scheme came into view. The heavy wrought iron gates at the front of my property were pinned wide open. The long, sweeping driveway was packed solid with high-end luxury vehicles. Sleek silver sports cars, heavy black SUVs, and imported sedans sat parked haphazardly across the cobblestones. It looked like a high-society gala had broken out in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. Colin had managed to draw out the wealthiest predatory cash buyers in the region, dangling the promise of a rapid undocumented sale on a premier piece of real estate. Alton parked the sedan near the edge of the property, well clear of the cluster of expensive cars. We stepped out into the crisp winter air. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving the estate grounds looking washed clean and strangely vivid. I looked up at the towering brick facade of the mansion. I remembered the day the contractors set the final stone in place. I remembered carrying Dorothea across the threshold. It was a monument to a shared lifetime of sacrifice. Watching a dozen strangers treat my home like a flea market bargain bin ignited a cold, heavy rage deep in my chest. We climbed the wide stone steps to the main entrance. The heavy double oak doors were propped wide open, welcoming a steady stream of potential investors. I did not storm inside. I raised a hand to signal Alton to hold just outside the threshold, in the shadows of the deep front portico. I wanted to see exactly how my son and his wife were selling their massive delusion. I wanted to witness the absolute peak of their arrogance before I dismantled it entirely. From the shadows of the portico, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the grand foyer and the sprawling formal living room beyond. The space hummed with the low chatter of wealthy investors examining the architecture. Standing at the center of the room, playing the gracious host to perfection, was my daughter-in-law Simone. She wore an immaculate ivory blazer and pressed slacks, her hair flawlessly styled, a crystal tray of expensive champagne flutes balanced in her hands. She drifted between clusters of older men in business suits, offering drinks and deploying a practiced, charming smile. I listened as her voice carried clearly over the ambient noise of the room. She was addressing a pair of real estate developers near the sweeping grand staircase. She laughed lightly and told them that she and Colin were simply looking to downsize their vast estate, that the house had grown far too large for their current minimalist lifestyle, and that they were eager to pass it along to another fortunate family. Her ability to lie with such effortless grace was truly breathtaking. She spoke as though she had personally laid the foundation, as though she held any right at all to decide the future of my home. My eyes drifted upward, following the direction of Simone's manicured finger. She was gesturing toward the ceiling, drawing every eye up to the massive, intricate crystal chandelier suspended from the soaring dome of the foyer. A sharp, painful tightening seized my chest. That chandelier was not simply a fixture. Years ago, I had quietly flown to Italy and personally selected it from a master glassmaker in Murano. I had it shipped across the ocean and installed in the dead of night as a surprise anniversary gift for Dorothea. She had wept the first time she saw it burning bright. It was the crowning jewel of everything I had built for her. Now, Simone was wielding my late wife's anniversary gift as a cheap bargaining chip. I listened as she promised the investors that if they submitted a favorable cash offer before the afternoon was out, she and Colin would generously leave the imported Italian chandelier behind as a gesture of goodwill. She was trading away my wife's memory to sweeten a fraudulent real estate deal. Across the room, stationed near the grand marble fireplace, stood Colin. He held a glass of scotch, leaning casually against the mantelpiece. He was deep in conversation with a prosperous-looking man gripping a leather portfolio. Colin was playing the part of the sophisticated property magnate without missing a beat. He gestured expansively around the room, talking about closing timelines and wire transfers. He looked entirely at ease, completely unaware that his protective bubble had already been dismantled downtown. He still believed his emergency court injunction had done its job. He was convinced I was rotting away in a cheap motel room, stripped of every legal right, while he brought the ultimate theft to completion. I had seen enough. The nauseating display of unearned arrogance had reached its absolute limit. I glanced at Alton, who stood quietly at my shoulder, his leather briefcase gripped firmly in his hand. He gave me a single firm nod, confirmation that we were fully prepared for whatever came next. I stepped out of the portico's shadows and moved directly into the center of the open doorway. I did not slip into my own house like an intruder. I pressed my hands flat against the heavy oak doors and drove them back until the brass hinges groaned loudly against the stone walls. The heavy crack of wood-meeting masonry rang through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. I crossed the threshold, planting my boots squarely on the imported marble floor. I drew my shoulders back to my full height, projecting every ounce of authority accumulated across a lifetime of corporate warfare. I did not look like a frail, confused man diminished by dementia. I looked like the undisputed master of the estate arriving to reclaim what was his. The effect was immediate. The sharp thud of the doors swinging wide drew heads toward the entryway. A ripple of recognition moved through the room. The low hum of investor conversation began to falter. The clink of champagne glasses went quiet. Within 5 seconds, the lively energy of the open house died completely. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the grand living room, as every pair of eyes in the place turned toward the man standing in the doorway. The echo of the oak doors faded slowly into total stillness. No one moved. The cash buyers, the real estate developers, the well-heeled socialites, all of them frozen mid-sentence staring at me. I did not adjust my posture. I stood tall in my damp winter overcoat boots, planted on the intricate marble floor, my gaze traveling in a straight line across the room to my son. Colin was beside the grand fireplace. His expensive glass of scotch stopped halfway to his mouth. The color left his face so quickly it was almost clinical, his skin going a sickly washed-out pale. For one unguarded fraction of a second, the polished mask of the wealthy property magnate fell away entirely. Beneath it, I saw the raw, genuine terror of a man who knew he had finally been caught in a catastrophic lie. But Colin was a creature of desperate vanity, his entire survival instinct built on a foundation of rapid, shameless deception. I watched him swallow hard, set his glass down heavily on the marble mantelpiece, and push across the Turkish kilim rugs toward me. His face cycled quickly from pale shock to a flushed, angry red. He forced a wide, intensely apologetic smile for the benefit of the watching investors, projecting the image of a devoted but burdened son managing a heartbreaking family crisis. He raised his hands in a theatrical calming gesture and addressed the crowd of wealthy strangers standing in my home. He pitched his voice to carry across the entire foyer. He asked the ladies and gentlemen to please excuse his father for the sudden interruption. He announced in a perfectly rehearsed tone of sorrow that I was very ill, terribly confused, suffering from advanced cognitive decline. He lied to the entire room without flinching, claiming that my condition had deteriorated sharply over recent weeks, and that he and Simone were in the painful, difficult process of arranging a placement in a secure medical facility for my own protection. He assured the buyers not to worry, telling them I had simply wandered off and that he would handle things with the utmost care. He was gaslighting me to my face, weaponizing my age, branding me a lunatic in public, simply to prop up his fraudulent transaction. While Colin delivered his pathetic speech, I looked past his shoulder and found Simone's eyes. She stood motionless near the grand staircase, still holding her silver tray of champagne flutes. Her face was a portrait of pure, undisguised panic. She knew I had never suffered from dementia. She knew precisely what she had done to my packed bags at 1 sewer in the morning. She read the grim determination on my face and understood at once that the old man had not returned to beg for a room. He had come back to burn the house down around them. Colin closed the remaining distance between us, stepping directly into my personal space. He shot his right hand out and clamped his fingers around my upper arm, driving his grip into the thick, wet wool of my overcoat. His intention was plain. He meant to physically turn me around, assert control, and march me back out the front doors before I could speak a coherent word to his audience of buyers. As his fingers tightened aggressively around my arm, a sudden and vivid memory cut through the moment with a wave of profound sorrow. I remembered being a young father in our very first modest home, long before the logistics empire and the millions ever materialized. Colin was 5 years old and utterly terrified of the dark during a fierce summer thunderstorm. I remembered sitting on the edge of his small bed, holding that exact same hand while he cried. I remembered wrapping my large, calloused fingers around his small, trembling ones and promising him I would always be there to keep the monsters at bay. I had spent my entire working life breaking my body and surrendering my own youth to honor that promise. I built a fortress to make certain he would never know fear or want. Now, 30 years on that very same hand was seizing me with aggressive, malicious intent. His hands were soft, unmarked by any real physical labor, yet they were attempting to shove me out into the cold so he could strip away my legacy and settle his gambling debts. The sheer betrayal of that grip extinguished whatever remnant of paternal mercy I still carried. The father who had wanted to shield him died the moment he filed those fraudulent court papers. Only the architect of the estate remained. I did not move a single inch. I am 72 years old, but my physical foundation was laid across decades of loading heavy freight onto shipping trucks. I rooted my boots into the marble floor, tensed my shoulder, and twisted my arm cleanly against his thumb. The sudden leverage snapped his grip and sent him stumbling backward into the center of the foyer. He caught himself, eyes wide with genuine surprise at the resistance he had not anticipated. He had spent so long convincing himself that I was a withering old man that he had begun to believe his own fiction. He opened his mouth perhaps to shout another desperate lie, perhaps to summon security, but I gave him no opportunity. I took one deliberate step aside and let my attorney take the floor. Alton Beckett stepped forward from the shadows of the deep front portico. He walked straight past Colin without so much as a glance in his direction, treating my son as though he were nothing more than an irrelevant piece of furniture. Alton moved with the lethal, unhurried confidence of a seasoned corporate litigator entering a courtroom he already controlled. He cut directly toward the massive marble kitchen island that divided the grand foyer from the formal dining room. The wealthy investors parted before him, like a tide drawing back, watching in confused, wary silence. Alton set his heavy leather briefcase down on the island's surface and unlatched the brass locks with a sharp metallic snap. He reached inside and drew out the thick, meticulously organized stack of airtight legal documents we had assembled across the previous 12 grueling hours, the medical certificate establishing my sanity, the irrevocable trust amendment severing my son from the fortune, and the original watermarked physical deed to the mansion. He lifted the heavy sheaf of parchment high and brought it down squarely onto the solid marble surface. The explosive crack of that thick paper striking stone reverberated through the silent house, rattling the crystal glasses in the hands of the stunned guests. That sharp percussion was a physical shockwave. It shattered the polished, comfortable atmosphere of the private open house in an instant. It was the sound of the trap snapping shut, catching my son inside his own malicious scheme and opening the stage for his public destruction. Every person in the room stood perfectly still, staring at the stack of documents resting on the counter. My attorney did not give anyone a moment to recover or reach for another fabricated excuse. He straightened the front of his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate adjustment that radiated pure predatory calm. Alton turned his gaze away from my trembling son and addressed the entire assembled room of potential buyers. His voice was pitched without effort, not a shout, but a low resonant delivery that traveled effortlessly across the imported rugs and up into the high ceilings. He introduced himself as the senior managing partner of his firm and the official legal counsel representing my estate. He informed the gathering that professional duty required him to halt the proceedings immediately and prevent everyone present from becoming an active participant in a massive federal fraud. The word fraud suspended itself in the air like a drop of poison dissolving in clear water. I watched the investors' posture shift at once. These were sharp, calculating men and women who guarded their capital with instinct and ferocity. Their polite curiosity hardened into defensive suspicion. Alton pressed his hand flat against the pile of documents on the island. He announced clearly and without qualification that his client Gerard Whitlow was the sole and exclusive legal owner of this entire property. He explained that the deed was held securely within the Dorothea Whitlow Trust, and that I was the only living trustee with authority to sanction a sale. He looked directly at the wealthy developer who had been deep in conversation with my son just minutes before. Alton stated that Colin Whitlow held absolutely zero equity in the estate, no power of attorney, no legal guardianship, no right of survivorship that could grant him any authority to list the home. My son moved to speak to try to salvage something from the burning wreckage of his grand illusion. He stammered, reaching for a defense, but Alton shut him down with a swift, merciless legal definition. He told the room that Colin was in strictly legal terms nothing more than a non-paying tenant who had dramatically overstayed his welcome. I shifted my attention from my son and looked toward the grand staircase where Simone was standing. The transformation unfolding across her face was a masterpiece of complete devastation. The composed, confident bearing she had maintained all afternoon dissolved entirely. The silver tray of champagne flutes in her hands began trembling so violently that the expensive crystal clinked together in a rapid, unsteady rhythm. Simone stared at the documents on the marble island, then turned her eyes slowly toward her husband. For the first time in their marriage, she was looking at the man she had actually wed rather than the billionaire heir he had always performed. I knew precisely what was racing through her calculating mind. She had spent her entire adult life chasing appearances and cementing her position among the elite. She had married Colin because he occupied a sprawling mansion and projected every outward sign of limitless generational wealth. She had endured his arrogance and his temper because she was certain that one day this entire estate would fall naturally into her hands. Now, standing in the foyer, she understood that the foundation of their marriage was a complete fabrication. The vast inheritance, the promised property, the endless flow of money. Every bit of it a lie. She had bound herself to a man drowning in illegal gambling debts who owned absolutely nothing. He was a squatter, living on the goodwill of the very same old man she had turned out into the freezing rain the night before. The realization that she was financially ruined and publicly exposed hit her with the force of a physical blow. The crowd's reaction was swift and without mercy. Wealthy people do not tolerate being made to look foolish, and they will not be lured into illegal real estate transactions without consequences. The carefully maintained warmth and hospitality of the open house evaporated on the spot. The real estate developer holding the leather portfolio snapped it shut with a sharp, disgusted motion. He looked at my son with unconcealed contempt. He told Colin that he had wasted his afternoon and that his legal team would be examining the fraudulent representation of the property. One by one, the remaining buyers followed. They set their half-empty champagne glasses down on whatever surface was nearest: marble counters, antique side tables, the lid of the grand piano, abandoning the false celebration without ceremony. A sudden urgent push toward the heavy oak front doors took hold. Investors seized their coats from the hall closet, trading angry remarks about the brazenness of the scheme. Not one of them offered my son so much as a glance of sympathy. They treated him like something to avoid, openly threatening to pursue him for misrepresentation and fraud as they moved through the foyer. Colin stood completely frozen in the center of the grand living room, watching his wealthy audience, the very people he had spent his whole life performing for, storm out of the house in a wave of righteous anger. He extended a hand weakly as though he could somehow physically pull them back and reverse what had happened. But he closed his fingers around nothing but empty air. The sound of expensive cars igniting their engines and accelerating down the long driveway drifted in through the open front doors, the unmistakable signal that his social standing was finished. Within 3 minutes, the massive house had emptied of every stranger. The silence that rushed back in was heavy and suffocating. It was only Alton, my son, my daughter-in-law, and me standing together in the wreckage of everything they had built. I watched Simone carefully lower the silver tray of champagne flutes onto a side table. She did not look at me. She did not look at Alton. She turned her body fully toward Colin. The panic and shock that had gripped her face moments ago had calcified into something far more dangerous. Her eyes were wide and charged with pure venom. The alliance forged on greed had collapsed entirely, and the war between them was about to begin. The last echo of the departing cars faded into silence. The grand foyer of my home was utterly still. The buyers were gone. The grand illusion was dead. Simone remained motionless near the grand staircase, her hands still trembling slightly after setting down the silver tray. She had turned her whole body toward her husband, not with love, but with the cold, calculating fury of a woman who had just grasped that her entire life rested on a worthless lie. Colin stood in the center of the room, on the Turkish kilim rug, completely paralyzed. His tailored suit seemed suddenly too large for him, as though the crushing weight of his failure had physically diminished him. He looked across at me, chest heaving, struggling to process the total collapse of the reality he had manufactured. My attorney, Alton Beckett, did not give my son a single moment to regroup. Alton was a master of legal warfare, and he knew precisely how to deliver the final fatal blow. He reached into his leather briefcase one last time and withdrew a single sheet of heavy legal paper. He did not slam this document onto the marble island. He walked directly up to Colin and held the paper out, forcing my son to confront the official county seal stamped at the top. Colin stared at it, eyes wide and completely stripped of composure. He refused to take it. He kept his hands pinned to his sides, as if making physical contact with the paper would somehow make it real. Alton simply released it. The page drifted down and came to rest face up on the floor, directly at my son's feet. Alton's voice when he spoke was perfectly calm and absolutely lethal. "This is a 48-hour eviction notice," Alton said. "The locks change on Monday." The words landed on Colin like a physical strike. His knees buckled. He did not stumble or sway. He simply dropped, collapsing straight down onto the cold marble floor, landing heavily on both knees beside the eviction notice. The arrogant, entitled property magnate evaporated on the spot. The man who had coldly ordered me out into the freezing rain at 1:00 in the morning was gone. In his place was a frightened, pathetic boy. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes brimming with tears of genuine panic. "Dad, please!" Colin begged, his voice fracturing into a desperate, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. You cannot throw me out. I have nowhere to go. I owe people money. They will kill me if I do not pay them. Please, Dad, I am your son. I will do whatever you want. I will go to rehab for the gambling. I will get a job. Just please do not take the house." I stood there in my damp winter coat and looked down at my only child on his knees. I searched my heart for a spark of mercy. I searched for the deep, overwhelming love that had once driven me to build everything around him. I expected to feel the agonizing pain of a father watching his son come apart in total despair. But as I looked at his tear-streaked face, I felt absolutely nothing. The empathy had been completely cauterized. Over the past 10 years, Colin had subjected me to a sustained campaign of quiet psychological abuse. He had taken my grief over his mother's death and turned it into a weapon, using my guilt to extract every ounce of wealth and energy I had left. He had treated me as a disposable nuisance, a human bank account to be drained and discarded whenever it suited his vanity. He was not crying now out of remorse for the pain he had caused me. He was crying because he had finally run out of other people's money to spend. Before I could respond, Simone erupted. The shock had worn through, and her survival instinct seized full control. She did not kneel to comfort her husband. She crossed the foyer in hard, sharp strides, her expensive heels striking the stone floor, and positioned herself directly over Colin. She unleashed a raw, ugly fury. "You lied to me!" She screamed, her voice cracking and bouncing off the high ceilings of the mansion. She drove both fists hard into his chest. "You have absolutely nothing. You are completely broke. You told me you owned this estate. You told me your father was leaving you millions of dollars. You are nothing but a pathetic squatter." Colin reached for her hands, pleading with her to calm down, begging her to stay and work through it together. Simone wrenched herself free of his grip with a violent twist. She looked at him with an expression of pure, undisguised contempt. Then she turned her back on him and ran up the grand sweeping staircase, heading for the master suite to collect her designer bags and leave him for good. Colin remained on his knees on the marble floor, sobbing uncontrollably, calling after his wife, begging me to tear up the eviction notice. He was a man entirely crushed beneath the weight of his own monstrous greed. I looked at the wreckage unfolding in the foyer of my beautiful home. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not make a dramatic final speech or demand an apology. My silence was absolute and complete. I simply turned my back on my son and walked out through the heavy oak front doors with Alton at my side. I descended the stone steps and drew in the crisp winter air, feeling a profound and clean sense of liberation. I left the mansion behind me in a state of total, deafening chaos. Their relentless greed had finally caught up to them, and it was consuming them from the inside out. Exactly 1 week had passed since those heavy oak doors had closed behind me for the last time. I stood in the center of the grand foyer on a final morning. The imported marble floors were bare. The furniture, the Turkish kilim rugs, the carefully chosen artwork, all of it had been cleared away by a professional estate liquidation company. The massive crystal chandelier, the one I had secretly flown to Italy to select for Dorothea in Murano, still hung from the soaring ceiling, but the life had been entirely drained from the room. The house was no longer a home. It was just a hollow shell of brick and glass. My son and his wife were gone. They had vacated exactly 48 hours after Alton handed them the eviction notice and retreated into the shadows of their own ruined reputations, left to work out how to survive without my accounts to bankroll their delusions. Alton Beckett stood beside me, his familiar leather briefcase in hand. We were not there to reflect on the past. We were there to complete the final transfer of power. Alton spread a thick stack of legal documents across a small folding table the liquidators had left in the empty room. These were not eviction notices or trust amendments. These were the official endowment papers. I picked up a plain black pen and signed my name across the bottom of each page. With every line of ink, I formally transferred ownership of the sprawling multi-million-dollar property to the Regional Veterans Housing Foundation. I was finally honoring the dying wish of my late wife. Dorothea had never truly wanted this massive suburban fortress. In the early days of the logistics company, when the money first started flowing in earnest, I had bought the estate as a grand romantic gesture, convinced it was the ultimate prize for everything we had endured together, that its sheer scale would somehow insulate us from the hardships of the world. But Dorothea was a woman of simple, profound taste. She told me often that the towering brick walls and the endless manicured lawns felt like a beautifully gilded cage. She stayed in this house only because she believed the prestigious neighborhood and the elite school district would give Colin the foundation he needed to become an honorable man. We had outgrown this opulent way of life decades earlier. Dorothea had always loved the ocean. She used to say she wanted nothing more than to grow old in a small, quiet house where she could fall asleep listening to the tide. I had held on to this massive estate long after she was gone, purely to preserve the appearance of a family for my son. Signing it over to the charity was not a loss. It was the absolute liberation of my soul. Alton gathered the signed documents and returned them carefully to his briefcase. He extended his hand, and I shook it firmly, knowing he had been the architect of my legal salvation. He assured me he would manage the remaining transition with the charity board and ensure my son's creditors could never reach a single dime of the endowment. I walked out through the heavy front doors and locked them for the very last time. I did not look back at the grand columns or the sweeping driveway. I got into my car and drove away from the affluent suburbs, leaving behind the socialites, the real estate developers, and the toxic legacy of unearned wealth. I drove north toward a destination I should have chosen 10 years ago. The long drive up the eastern seaboard gave me time to let the deep silence of my new reality settle over me. I watched city skylines dissolve into open highways and dense pine forests. I arrived at the Maine coast just as the evening tide was rolling in. I had purchased a small weathered cabin right at the water's edge months before, but never found the courage to move there while Colin was still suffocating my life. Now, the cabin was my entire world. It was a modest wooden structure, faded gray shingles, a wide wraparound porch opening directly onto the boundless Atlantic. No imported marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, just the sturdy, honest construction of a house built to hold its ground against powerful coastal storms. I rose the following morning, well before the sun broke the horizon. Not to a cell phone shuddering with alerts, not to the shrill demands of an ungrateful daughter-in-law, not to the suffocating pressure of a family working methodically to dismantle my sanity. I woke to the steady rhythmic collapse of ocean waves against the shore. The cabin air was crisp and carried the sharp, clean scent of sea salt and weathered driftwood. I moved into the small kitchen and brewed a plain pot of dark coffee. I had no need for a private caterer or an elaborate breakfast spread. I filled a heavy stoneware mug with the steaming black liquid and carried it out onto the wooden deck. The coastal wind found the collar of my flannel jacket immediately, but it felt bracingly good. I leaned against the railing and watched the dark sky soften through deep shades of purple and then blazing orange. The sun climbed over the vast dark ocean and cast a brilliant ribbon of gold across the rolling water. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee and let the bitter warmth settle deep into my chest. I glanced down at my phone sitting on the wooden table beside me. The screen was dark and still. No alerts from bank managers, no frantic messages from my son, no desperate pleas for another bailout. The chaotic, loud, demanding world I had tolerated for an entire decade was entirely gone. Cutting my only child out of my life had been the most painful, agonizing undertaking of my 72 years on this earth. It demanded that I deliberately break my own heart in order to preserve my own soul. But standing on that deck drawing in the cold salt air, I understood that the heavy burden of manufactured guilt had been lifted from me completely. I had finally learned that character cannot be purchased and love cannot be subsidized. Real respect grows from honesty and the courage to hold firm boundaries, not from endless financial sacrifice. I watched the seabirds arc and dive toward the rolling waves and felt a deep, unshakable tranquility settle into my bones. If you have stayed with me this far, I want to thank you. This story cost me more than I ever expected to carry alone. Looking back now from this quiet cabin on the Maine coast, I understand what the last decade really was. It was a slow erosion of boundaries, of dignity, of the simple right to be treated as a human being rather than a resource. Releasing Colin was not something I chose out of anger. It was something I chose out of survival. I believe God does not ask us to bankrupt our souls in the name of family loyalty. He asks us to be faithful stewards of the life and the legacy we built. And sometimes that means walking away from the people who are consuming both. The pain of that decision does not go away, but neither does the peace that follows it. If this family revenge story has spoken to you at all, here is what I hope you take with you. Do not fund a lifestyle you did not create. When your money becomes someone else's entitlement, You are not being generous, you are being harvested. Document everything before you act. Quiet preparation is more powerful than any confrontation you could have in the heat of the moment. If someone tries to rewrite your mind, your competency, or your history, let the records answer for you. Truth does not need your voice raised to be heard. And for every adult's 50-plus man or woman sitting with a similar weight right now, your legacy belongs to you, not to the people who assumed they would inherit it without earning it. If this story moved, you leave a thought in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, there are more of these waiting for you. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.